Wireless, a key piece of the autism puzzle, and what you can do about it. So what's changed that's made it harder for our children to reach their full potential? Why do they not develop naturally like they used to? Okay. So here's an interesting question. This is supposed to be kind of controversial. If 1 in 50 iPhones wasn't working at its full potential, how long would that go on? I mean, I was a technical troubleshooter, in the early 90s, maybe a month if it was a really bad problem, and probably a lot of folks would get fired, right? So we know as a troubleshooter, when you guess a couple times, and this happens with you guys all the time, you think about something, you mitigate, you take a couple guesses, and it doesn't work. So what do you have to do? You start systematically writing down all the possibilities, and you step through them. You go, well, my 2 guesses weren't right. So how many boards are there in the computer? I'm going to replace every one. How many different things? Now, if you're a doctor, you can't replace every organ in the person, but if you work on the environment, you can systematically go through and evaluate all the different factors. So that is my troubleshooting modality, is to be very systematic and objective, and I bring that from the tech world into environmental health. So researchers are now including EMF and wireless in the list of environmental suspects, and my epiphany for that really came at the Commonwealth Club event in 2010, when I was sitting there when you guys were talking about calcium efflux, and I'd been following autism research for 10 years, and the chief scientist would I'd be, watch the calcium channel. And at the time they said, we've got about 1 in 100 electrosensitive folks, and autism was around that number at that time, and I'm like, ding, ding, ding. So that kind of got me moving in this direction. So I want to talk about, many people think autism is a genetic condition, and it's something that you have for a lifetime. I want to reframe that. This is from Martha Herbert from Harvard. She talks about autism as a state of overload, okay? It's a state of overload from multiple factors, from total load, and you've heard that discussed this morning when we talked about mold, the rain barrel analogy, okay? And I've got some other analogies we'll talk about too. So again, this load applies to the child. The child is the canary in the coal mine, but the load is applying to everyone in the family. So that's important to know. And so again, this is the analogy is, okay, you raise taxes. For some people, that's devastating. For other people, they just kind of laugh, right? But it's all about when you get to this tipping point, or if it's a business, if you get into the red ink, that's kind of the issue. Again, and so one of the analogies, so we've been playing around with a lot of these load analogies. So we talked about the rain barrel. I've done detox work and toxin work for about 10 years, and I like the rain barrel as a start, and then you talk about the fact that your body is detoxing. So what about a funnel? So you've got a funnel, you've got toxins going in, and then you've got the body is detoxing, right? So it's not just about what's coming in, but it's about what you can detox out, right? And your body, depending on genetics and physiology, and even your fight or flight mode, what mode you're in, that funnel can open and close. And when you go into fight or flight mode, you deprioritize detox, okay? So that's like tightening the belt at the bottom of the funnel. So I like that model. Some other folks have been using a seesaw as a model. And you add a couple things, then you add maybe something minor, and it just tips, right? You get to this tipping point. So I've actually been using another model that I'm starting to play around with. This is a more evolved model. I think you guys might like it because it kind of brings in some of these environmental factors. So this is another model, kind of like the rain barrel, but a little bit more evolved. We've got positive factors above the line. So this is like if it was a business, that would be revenue. You're adding revenue. Anything below the line is a load, is one of these loads we've talked about. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got all the environmental factors, okay? And you can look at, we've got mold, we've got noise, toxin, that sort of stuff. And there are positive factors, okay? On the left-hand side, you've got the body. You've got these positive factors going on, you've got these negative factors. Now, we also realize that sometimes there's something in the middle that, your body is sensitive to something, and maybe it's overreactive. It's, sensitive to nickel, or mold or something, and you respond differently than other folks. So there's this something in the middle, which is kind of like the body's response. And is the response adaptive or is it not? Right? Sometimes the solution is not to change the environment, not to change the body, but it's to retrain the fight or flight response or the body's response to it. And you've seen some of that, people trying to deprogram allergies and that sort of stuff. People work with that, trying to turn the allergies off and get the response to change. Okay. So this is the model I like to work on. I like this too because it's positive, that there's no limit on the thriving part, right? It's not just about the negative. We're talking about the goal is thriving. We're going up. We're going to cut the loads off. You might have to cut 2, 3, 4 things before you see the balloon go up. And you've all had that experience. You do something, you think it's going to be really good, nothing changes. And you go, you're kind of bummed out, but then 2, 3 more things, and then all of a sudden you start to see a lift. Okay, so I want to ground this experience also a little bit more in your personal experience. So has everyone had a hangover or a concussion? Has anyone had a hangover or a concussion? Not right now. I've got a hangover right now, actually. And I'm just working through it, so be patient with me. No. So when you have a hangover, I'm trying to get you to understand what it feels like to be an autistic kid, or I'm just as sensitive to dirty electricity as Michael. And the kids are just as sensitive as Michael, if not more so, right? So they're feeling all this stuff, right? And so when you have a hangover, what happens? You start to become a little more sensitive to light and sound. You don't want the radio up. You're kind of. That's what happens to these kids. These kids become very sensitive. My oldest son was diagnosed with sensory integration, which is kind of the mildest form of autism, and it's a symptom that almost all autistics have, and quite a few adults have. Maybe about 30% of adults are affected by this, and maybe 10% in a pretty heavy way. So they're sensitive to light, sound, and noise. And what's happening is that inflammation, a lot of these things that we work with, mold, toxins, EMF, raise inflammation. And Martha Herbert from Harvard was trying to clue me into how all of these things work together. Inflammation at an electrical level is noise. Okay, it's like a speed bump going down the road. Okay, so now you've got more inflammation, which means you've got more electrical noise in your head, which makes you feel like your thinking is fuzzy when you have a concussion. You just don't feel sharp. All right, so there's this inflammation, electrical noise, and then you've had this experience of having kind of fuzzy thinking, and could be from gluten, could be from EMF. That was one of my first signs of being EMF sensitive, is I'd get near a transformer, and for 40 minutes, my head was just like, what's going on? Okay, so can you relate to that experience? Okay, great. So again, we talked a little bit about overload of the detox system and the liver system. That's what's going on when you're toxic, right? You're having a hard time kind of getting all that stuff out. You also got a little bit of inflammatory overload. You don't really feel like being so social, right? So these kids have social issues. It's not a priority. When you're hungover, your priority is to get unhungover and to recover, and then you go out and be social, and you restore your performance to what you're used to, what your expectations are, and you're not going to really, I don't know how to explain. You're not going to be jumping around. You're not drawn to social experience because it's not, doesn't feel good. It's overloading. It's another sense of load for these kids. So you could understand why these kids are sensitive to all these things and why they're not so social. If you could have that experience and understand that. Okay, now. So let's say you're drinking a lot, and then the next day you get a hangover. And a concussion's a similar way. Let's say you're a boxer, you get hit, and you got this concussion. Let's say you're boxing every day. Let's say you get more damage than your body can repair. Well, that's a state of overload, okay? And you could understand how this could appear as though it was a permanent condition if you had more environmental impact, than you could repair and manage. Okay? Especially if it's invisible, right? And that's a really tough one. So after the Commonwealth Club in 2010, I talked to a couple folks. I talked to George Carlo, I talked to Cindy Sage, And eventually I started bridging, I talked to Martha Herbert at Harvard and got her connected with Cindy Sage. And I was hoping she would write a one-pager that just said, hey, until we know how this all works, we should look at EMF. Okay. So hook her up with Cindy Sage. She calls me back about a couple weeks later, and she's like, she's swearing a little bit. She's a little loose and fun. She's like, what the, there's blood-brain barrier, there's gap junction, there's all this stuff going on. I'm like, I know. When I read the bio initiative, it was shocking, right? And so she writes a 100-page paper for the bio initiative, and you can find that online. And so that eventually, so it's 100 pages. Honestly, I should be interested. I haven't even read the whole damn thing, right? Don't tell her that. I hope this, oops, too late. No. So on the left, we have the known symptoms of autism. So what she did is, and she was really smart, she says it's not about the correlation of RF going up and so forth. She says, we need to do this in a smarter way, because everyone's going to say correlation doesn't mean causation and all that stuff. That just means it's a potential that we should look at it. So Martha says, okay, let's just go down the list of all the known autism symptoms and match them up to what we know. So the one that concerns me the very most, a lot of these things are reversible. In autism in 2007, I got called in to a presentation. They were talking about genetic issues, and they brought up this thing called a de novo mutation. I don't know if people understand what that is, but that's a non-inherited mutation. That means that genes from my body did not make it to my kid 100% perfectly copied, okay, or from my wife or whatever. So most people think, it's all genetic. Well, a Stanford twin study showed us it's only 37% genetic, and all the rest is environmental. Okay, and this big genetic study came out in 2014, said, well, of all these genetic issues, the majority are de novo mutations. And I'm like, okay. So in 2007, when I first heard about this, I thought, it's going to be mercury or some toxin. And then we started thinking about cell phone in the pocket and the RF issues with that. And so that's my number one suspect right now, is the cell phone in the pocket for de novo mutations. So if you have people who are having infertility problems,
or the Wi-Fi on the lab.
The Wi-Fi on the lab for the mom, right? The mom. So that's the Baby Safe Project, exactly. So I honestly don't think the cell phone in the pocket is the entire solution, because I don't think we had a lot of that in the late 80s and so forth. So I think there's a lot of other factors. The age of the father, there's a lot of, and even just more sympathetic nervous system. When you're in fight or flight mode, I think you're not just detoxing less, you're repairing less, right? It's not a priority. So it might be as subtle as that as well. So de novo mutations are a major concern. So keeping that away from the body for whatever the sperm count, I think it's like a 3-month turnover for sperm. We have to look that up formally. So getting that out of the front pocket for men. So we've talked about the sperm damage. I think Joel Moskowitz Martha looked at about 16 different studies on sperm. Joel Moskowitz looked at about 10. 9 of the 10 showed damage, including DNA damage. So the science on that one is really solid. And so that's the one that is the most concerning, because it's pretty permanent, and the science is solid. So I think that's good. We'll talk more about that later tomorrow. Calcium channel dysregulation, influx, efflux, inflammation. The fact that there's melatonin disruption, we know melatonin is low in autism, and we know that with EMF, EMF is light at a lower frequency. So the hypothesis is that the body's thinking the light's still on. Basically, why would we have evolved to have some sort of filter to filter that frequency out? Because that frequency has never been around, right? Okay, so increased oxidation, decreased immune system, increased seizures. And I think the one that Martin Paul has been talking about too is also synaptic formation, calcium signaling for synaptic formation, and in pruning. And I need to add that one in as well to go a little deeper on that. Okay. Now, I think this is the one that Martin Paul and I talked in December, and I was really excited. My experience was that for myself and for my kids, removing toxins and removing EMFs helped my kids recover. My kids recovered. I got better too. When I talked to Martin, so I've had this experience, and I have Martha talking about plausibility, but Martin just went for it. And he said, I think we've got all the pieces of the puzzle here. He talked about everything that we've just talked about. He talked about EMF, he's talked about chemicals, and he's talked about the sperm damage. And he sat there and he said, I think we have all the pieces of the puzzle. I think we can put it all together. And I said, I think you're right. All right, let's talk about this at Autism 1. And we did. with Dr. Klinghardt. So we had 3 speakers at the time. So Dr. Paul talked about, is an expert at the voltage-gated calcium channels in cell membranes. Speaking tomorrow morning. So this was just like Autism 1. I'm his kind of like his intro guy. And I'm the parent. I can talk about this at a high level, help try to communicate this in layperson's terms, and then you point to the scientist. And that's my job. So Martin is saying basically that EMF is causing calcium channel efflux, and that calcium is screwing up nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is used to regulate our inflammatory response. Martin will probably polish that a little bit more, but that's my take on it. And he also talks about, but it's not the whole story, right? So it's the chemical toxins are activating the NMDA receptors. And that is also raising inflammation up. And these receptors are involved in reward and addiction. Okay. And there's also EMF effects with NMDA receptors as well. So again, both of these mechanisms are leading to increased inflammation. So I think if we're going to look at a biomarker to measure autism, which has been a real struggle, to be honest, a biological biomarker, not just behavior, I think inflammation's a good one to start with. And it turned out for me, after 10 or 12 years of going through this, everything that worked was an anti-inflammatory or avoiding some sort of inflammatory factor, whether it was gluten-free diet or random sports recovery drink that I start drinking, and I'm like, hey, my head feels better. Oh, turmeric in this, okay. Okay. So the one thing that I want to add a little bit into this that is also fight or flight mode. Again, so EMF gets us more into the sympathetic nervous system or more into fight or flight response. And again, when you are, so you see these kids stimming, right? Stimming is self-stimulatory behavior. You'll see flapping. Have you seen kids flap? Or they're just agitated, and you look at these kids, you're like, they look wild, okay? So these kids are in fight or flight mode, but also there's some working off energy. Like if they're in a lot of electric fields, I think they're trying to work off the incoherence and the chaos of that. There's also a lot of, this is interesting, runaways in autism. So these kids run away from home. And now they want to put, you'll love this, they want to put tags on them to track them. Like, probably not a good idea. I would actually say that the autism runaway situation, although it terrifies the parents, it's probably a fairly adaptive response to the situation, which is get the heck out of this unsafe scenario. All right, so again, now the tricky part is, though, that this fight or flight mode can cause more inflammation because you're dialing down the amount of detox you're doing, which means you can get more backup in the chemicals. The body becomes pro-inflammatory. If you're going to start fighting, your body wants to be able to respond to any injury, so it's going to get it ready to fix it. So you're in this hyper-vigilant mode. Dr. Hope this morning talked about her 2 patients coming in. Some would be super hyper-vigilant, and some would be kind of sloppy. And to me, that kind of shows these different nervous system responses to the same physical thing going on. And I think a lot of that depends on the energy level of the body. One of them, I think, that low response, that sloppy response, is around conserving energy, and the higher response is around maintaining coherence and keeping it all together.
What about adrenal fatigue?
And adrenal, exactly. There's a lot of thyroid and adrenal and this sort of thing. Right, exactly. So you're just kind of kicking it into this downward spiral of chemicals, EMF, chemicals, fight or flight mode, inflammation, downward. It's a death spiral. Okay, so we need to start pulling things out. We need to get out of the death spiral. Okay, and so again, when you're in fight or flight mode, our high priorities are our high priority things, or our more sustainable things that we need, detox, digestion, repair, growth, DNA repair, are deprioritized. So if someone, yeah, so we've got that. Let's see, and we've kind of talked about that cycle. So let's just put the whole piece together here. Genetics, we talked about the genetic part, and you could have calcium channel variations so to make you more susceptible to the voltage-gated calcium channel dysregulation. And some of this can be inherited or non-inherited. You can have your biological capacity, how much melatonin, how much glutathione you have. The chemical toxins we talked about, the one we're most concerned about that's rising is glyphosate, the Roundup ingredient. A lot of the other ones are actually not going up so much. and of course wireless and EMF, and that's the big one. And I think that's the one. I think this is a key. The reason I call this a key piece is because it can potentially be affecting the genetics, the de novo mutation. It can be drawing down biological capacity, your melatonin, and oxidation, inflammation. And again, it's by getting you into fight or flight mode, it can be contributing to your chemical toxic load. And so that leads to a state of overload. Okay, so what you can do today, Cindy Sage and Toril Yelter was an electrosensitive doctor in Northern California, came up with a really novel protocol. I thought that I was struggling. I thought we were gonna have to build Faraday cages for these kids. I thought we were gonna have to, everyone's gonna have their own building biologist come out, or we're gonna be renting meters, right? So there's a huge scaling issue here, and I was freaking out over this.
That's
Because
a good idea, though.
it's a great, this is all gonna work out. Trust me on this. We'll come back to this. But I didn't think we'd be able to, I thought we were gonna be all overloaded, because once this information gets out at a larger level, we might not be able to, this is gonna be a wave that goes over us. So this protocol is really interesting.
We're up for the challenge.
You're up for the challenge. This is gonna be kind of you're gonna love how this all works out. This is a win for everybody. So they came up with this brilliant idea of just at night unplugging your baby monitor, your cordless phone base station, your Wi-Fi router, and then flipping the circuit breaker to the bedroom. And they do this for about 2 weeks, and they do a little trial. She does a survey before and a survey after. Now this is so. What do you think happened? And this is really surprising. More than 80% of the kids improved. Okay. Now, most of the time, they at least see the improvement in 2 weeks. It's very subtle. It's like just slowly watching the grass grow, but it's moving. It's the balloons starting to rise. What's really fun is in about 10% of the cases, there's some really rapid improvement. So we had one boy after 3 days who it was nonverbal, blurt out a full sentence. Yeah. I had one boy who was older boy, 21 or 19, 20, 21 in that area. The mother just turned off the Wi-Fi. The next day, the caregiver looked at the mom and was like, "What did you do? This kid is completely different. He's focused, he's on task. What did you do?" "All I did is turn off the Wi-Fi." One night. Okay. But don't set expectations that will happen for everyone. It's more rare. Most of the time will be this slow melting. And actually, to be honest, a lot of times my parents don't notice it. Even after months, I come back to the house, I see the eye tracking on the kids, everything's better. I'm like, "Oh my God, this kid's really improving." And the parents are like, "Oh, well, we're doing other stuff." And I'm just like, okay, well, we need better metrics. We need better metrics to measure how this is working. And again, we're funding work at Harvard to look at EEG work around this. So I think I'm excited about that. And again, for the 20% of the folks that aren't improving, it doesn't mean that EMF's not a factor. It means we cut the load and the balloon didn't go up.
Well, there could be another circuit. There could
And
be
there,
magnetic-
and these are and we did something very, very simple. We could have current on the pipe. We could have these more complex issues we could have.
other circuits.
Exactly. It means now it's time to call a building biologist at least.
Yes. There it is.
Like I wasn't going to do that. Yeah. All right. So the resources, and look at the resources and support. So building biologists, and this is what you do next. You hire a consultant. You have a professional measure your house. We've got resources on our website, Clearlight Ventures. We just started a Facebook group, Autism and EMF, and feel free to join even if you're not a parent and contribute. Alan Maher Designs, there's been some really interesting noise reduction technology that Michael talked about today. Alan has been working on audio for almost 40 years, and he has some really interesting devices that work on power factor correction and grounding, and they don't draw any current, and I really like that because I'm really sensitive to that. So I've got some of his devices here. I've got some of his technology, and we'll bring it in tomorrow and play with that a little bit, see if you guys can feel that. lessemf.com, again, for parents.
We have the proprietor of Safe Living Technologies, Rob Messinger, with us as well.
Safe Living as well,
Yeah.
right. So when I was in Chicago, this was, yeah, exactly. I think so we have Safe Living, tends to be a little bit more for professional, high end, and
He has consumer products.
you have consumer products too. Okay, so let's do that. We'll point to both. All right, so that's basically the autism overview of where we are with autism and EMF.